I am a self-professed believer in footnotes. I love a little excursion while reading, or a deeper explanation, or some source material revealed at the bottom of a page. Where they belong, I might add. Don't even get me started on endnotes. There are even footnotes in many Bibles, and we make good use of them in our Wednesday evening Bible study class. There are quite literally footnotes walking all over our appointed lessons, from the dreams and schemes and evil plots afoot in the story of Joseph and his brothers, not to mention the many footsteps they left as they walked from the Hebron Valley to Dothan near Shechem, where their father's flocks were kept, to the image of Joseph's feet bound in fetters, about which the psalmist strangely sings. The beautiful feet of bearers of good news that Paul makes reference to in his letter to the Romans, and both Jesus's and Peter's feet as they step out over a stormy sea. Hardly pedestrian scenes, any of these, but resplendently strange and curious ones all. If anything, our lessons and the long tradition of their interpretation and translation imply that there is always more to the story than first meets the eye, that we ought to pay attention to the context in which each passage unfolds, and the footnotes others who have walked before us have left for our edification, and to pay attention not only to the text itself, but to the margins, and who and what might be revealed there. When Paul writes to the Romans, as it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news, for example, we might note that he is footnoting the prophet Isaiah, who proclaimed, how beautiful upon the mountains are the feet of the messenger who announces peace, who brings good news, who announces salvation, who says to Zion, your God reigns. In Psalm 105, David gives praise to that ultimate sovereignty. In this, one of the great historical psalms written generations after the events portrayed in our reading from Genesis, do we also find a footnote to Joseph's story. He sent a man before them, Joseph, who was sold as a slave. They bruised his feet in fetters. His neck they put in an iron collar. The big picture, the psalm proclaims, is that God was working out a good purpose in all of these tragic events. Because of Joseph, who his brothers had left for dead, the descendants of Abraham will not succumb to the famine. What's more, the story will end not only with the rescue from starvation, but even more remarkably, with forgiveness. What we don't get to see or hear today, but will in our readings next Sunday, is the part where Joseph and his brothers will fall upon each other's necks and weep. Joseph and his brothers reunited and reconciled. The grace of example. But I'm jumping ahead. We're not quite there in the text before us. Verse 3 of our reading from Genesis says, now Israel, i.e. Jacob, loved Joseph more than any other of his children, because he was the son of his old age, and he had made him a long robe with sleeves. I have to tell you that I had to stop and reread that verse several times. I was psyched when I realized we would be hearing from the story of Joseph in our readings this week, because, truth be told, I wanted to go all Broadway in my sermon and preach about Joseph's amazing Technicolor dream coat. But what I remembered, or thought I remembered about Joseph's coat, well, it just wasn't in the text. Israel made him a long robe with sleeves. Talk about anticlimactic. Perhaps my memory was faulty, or my dreams a little too much off Broadway. But wait, it's the King James Version come to the rescue. According to the translation, some say is the most faithful to the original, not to mention the most beautiful in terms of language. Israel made Joseph a coat of many colors. Yes, justification. Until, that is, I read the blasted footnote, or a coat of many pieces. Oh dear, which is it then, long-sleeved or many-colored or a patchwork of pieces? And does any of this really matter? It has been said that God is in the details, but I think perhaps the same can hold true for footnotes. A note in the Oxford Annotated Bible, for example, explains, "A long robe with sleeves was a luxurious robe different from the ordinary sleeveless tunic, which reached only to the knees." It turns out the robe was considered to be long because of a Hebrew word that can be interpreted as reaching to the palm of the hand or to the ankle of the foot. Long sleeves and long tunics were traditionally a sign of one who did not have to work, someone who was exempt from manual labor, while laborers wore shorter garments. Following this note, the implications of Israel's making such a garment for Joseph surely would not have been lost on Joseph's brothers. Keeping with this same image of reaching to the palm, other interpreters, however, insist that the robe was made of stripes of various colors, each stripe being a palm's width, or that there were stripes of colors that reached from the neck of the garment all the way to the palms of the hand and to the ankles of the feet. See 2 Samuel chapter 13, verses 18 to 19, says another footnote in parentheses. And here is where I think it gets really interesting. For in 2 Samuel we read about Tamar, daughter of King David, sister of Absalom, who was wearing a long robe with sleeves, for thus were the virgin daughters of the king clad in old. It's the same phrase for the long robe with sleeves in the story of Joseph, katanet pasim, in the original Hebrew. The only places in all the Bible that we can find mention of a katanet pasim are in the story of the robe Israel made for Joseph and in the story of Tamar in 2 Samuel, where we are given not just a description of the robe, but the traditional reason for wearing it. Regardless of whether it was many-colored or long-sleeved, why would Jacob make for his son Joseph a robe traditionally worn by the virgin daughters of a king, a princess gown? Long-sleeved and flowing, or a rainbow of colors, doesn't everything about this story change when we consider the possibility that Joseph's robe was an amazing gender non-conforming dream coat? Just as David recounted the history of Israel in order to make it relevant to his day, we might, if we pay attention to the margins, to the words surrounding the main text, consider that in the story of Joseph's coat we can sense the footprints of an ancient forebear of our trans siblings today, and in the violence directed towards them, an unacceptable repetition of Joseph's brothers' actions. They saw him from a distance, and before he came near to them, they conspired to kill him. They said to one another, "Here comes this dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we shall say that a wild animal has devoured him, and we shall see what will become of his dreams." But when Reuben heard it, he delivered him out of their hands, saying, "Let us not take his life." Reuben said to them, "Shed no blood. Throw him into this pit here in the wilderness, but lay no hand on him, that he might rescue him out of their hand and restore him to their father." What I find most damning in this story is not the plot to kill Joseph, so much as Reuben's complicity. even though the text says he delivered Joseph out of his brother's hands, and implies that he perhaps intended to circle back to the pit and rescue him and restore him to their father. The result is hardly courageous. Selling off their brother to a life of slavery in another country, he might as well have been dead. And what about their father? How did they ever manage to look him in the eye after they returned without Joseph and holding only the robe Israel had made for him? Old Testament scholar Walter Brueggemann refers to Reuben as the responsible coward. Being the eldest of the brothers in the culture of the day, he could have shut the whole thing down. But instead of rejecting the violence outright, he plays to their line, offers a compromise, a lesser injustice, as if that made it okay. Reuben's complicity is merely part and parcel of all the rest of his brothers' sins of commission and sins of omission. The grace, if unlikely this time, of example, calling us to examine how each of us, myself included, have thought something to be wrong in private, yet have not said so, taken a stand in public. In his book, The Alphabet of Grace, the late Frederick Buechner advised that if you want to know who you are, watch your feet, because where your feet take you, that is who you are. We are neither built for sitting nor standing still. We are meant to walk one step at a time. But here's the thing. Walking is really more like falling, but catching ourselves with each step before we fall. An ongoing process of loss and recovery of balance. To be human is to wander, to fall forward into time over and over again, catching our balance each time, moving to the pilgrim rhythm of exile and return. And so we look to the grace of examples, e.g., Joseph and his brothers, yes, even Reuben, maybe especially Reuben. We look to David and to Paul, and to Peter stepping out of the boat and onto the sea in faith. And most of all, we look to Jesus, whose feet trod the way from the shores of the Sea of Galilee and even over its waters to the Garden of Gethsemane and on to Golgotha and right on into our hearts. Jesus walked, leaving us footnotes all along the way. That wonderful abbreviation we find so often in parentheses, e.g., for example, is short for the Latin exempli gratia, or by the grace of example. And so, my friends, may we walk by faith and in the example of those in whose footsteps we find a good path to follow. And as for shoes for our feet, may we heed St. Paul's words to the Ephesians and put on whatever will make us ready to proclaim the gospel of peace. And may we sing, guide my feet, hold my hand, precious Lord, and lead me home.